They had the weapon. They had the choice. And they were afraid, not of using it, afraid of something more specific than that. There was a third option, one that some of the men in that room argued for with genuine conviction. Show Japan what the bomb could do, not on a city, not on people. On empty ground, or open water, or some remote stretch of land far from anything that breathed. Let them watch, let them understand, and then ask them to surrender. It sounds, on the surface, like the merciful move. The obvious move, the one you'd hope serious men would at least try. But they said no, not casually, not without argument, but no. And the reason they said no is more uncomfortable than most people expect. Not indifference, not bloodlust. It was a fear so specific, so calculated, that understanding it changes how you think about everything that followed. The summer of 1945 was not going the way anyone had hoped. Europe was done. Germany had collapsed. But the Pacific War was something else entirely. Allied planners had already begun drafting timelines for a land invasion of Japan, and the casualty projections they were working with weren't small numbers. They were staggering. Some estimates placed American losses alone in the hundreds of thousands. Japanese military and civilian losses potentially in the millions. The war had lasted 6 years already, and it showed no signs of ending cleanly. Into this pressure came a group of men who called themselves the Interim Committee, and one of their first serious arguments nearly changed the course of everything. They weren't elected. They weren't generals. They were a small collection of senior officials, scientists, and advisors, assembled specifically to think through what came next with the atomic bomb. What it was. What it could do. And, most critically, how and whether it should be used. The committee first met in May of 1945. And from the beginning, one question kept surfacing that no one could fully dismiss. What if they didn't drop it on a city? The idea of a demonstration wasn't fringe. Some of the most serious scientific minds working on the bomb had already raised it. Men who had spent years building the weapon were genuinely uncertain about whether it should be used the way military planners were suggesting. They had seen what it could do in testing. They understood the scale. And some of them were asking whether showing that scale publicly, dramatically, without killing anyone, might accomplish the same strategic goal: force Japan to acknowledge the reality of what they faced. Offer them a way out before the killing started. It wasn't a naive idea. It was a question that deserved a serious answer. And it got one, just not the one those scientists were hoping for. The committee began working through the demonstration argument methodically. If you were going to demonstrate the bomb, you needed Japan to actually witness it. That meant either inviting Japanese officials to observe a test, or detonating it somewhere visible enough that the message couldn't be misread. The first problem: secrecy. The atomic bomb program was one of the most tightly held secrets of the war. Revealing the location of a planned detonation in advance meant risking Japanese interference, or worse, an attempt to disrupt the test entirely. If Japan moved prisoners of war to the demonstration site, or sent aircraft to intercept, the entire strategic calculus collapsed. But that wasn't the committee's deepest concern. The deepest concern was simpler and more terrifying. What if the bomb didn't work? Here's the part that almost never makes it into the casual version of this history. The first full detonation of an atomic device happened in July of 1945. Just weeks before the bombs were ultimately used. It worked. But it had never been done before. The technology was new. The engineering was unprecedented. And the committee was operating in a world where there was no reliable track record of atomic detonations succeeding on demand, under field conditions, at a moment of enormous political consequence. There had been exactly one test, one data point. In a controlled desert environment, under optimal preparation, with every available expert on hand to manage the variables. A live demonstration staged for Japanese observers was a different kind of event entirely. The pressure would be different. The stakes of any malfunction would be categorically different. A failed demonstration wouldn't just be an embarrassment, it would be a catastrophe. If Japan watched an atomic bomb fail to detonate or produce a smaller than expected yield, the strategic message would flip entirely. Instead of communicating overwhelming, unstoppable power, the United States would have communicated vulnerability, uncertainty, the possibility that the weapon was overhyped, or unreliable, or not quite as final as advertised. And that perception could harden Japanese resolve rather than break it. The military logic here was blunt. If your one shot at psychological shock fails, you don't get another one. You've spent your leverage and gotten nothing. Japan's leadership, particularly its military faction, would take that failure and use it. Proof that the Americans were bluffing. Proof that holding out was worth it. The committee wasn't dismissing the demonstration argument. They were taking it seriously enough to see all the ways it could go wrong. And here's where the evidence made it worse. By the summer of 1945, American forces had already conducted some of the most destructive conventional bombing campaigns in the history of warfare against Japan. Dozens of cities had been struck. In a single night over Tokyo in March of that year, fires had consumed enormous portions of the city and killed tens of thousands of people. Industrial centers had been reduced. Supply lines had been severed. Civilian casualties were accumulating at a pace that, by any historical standard, should have been decisive. And Japan had not surrendered. If months of that, on a scale that was itself historically unprecedented, hadn't forced a surrender, the committee had a serious question to answer. Why would a single, even larger explosion in an unpopulated area accomplish what sustained, massive, visible destruction had not? The demonstration, in this framing, was not obviously more persuasive than what had already been tried. It was asking Japan's leadership to make a different calculation than they had been making in the face of everything that had already happened. And the committee was not confident that calculation would change based on one spectacular detonation over uninhabited ground. But let's stay with that a moment, because there's a question underneath it that doesn't get asked enough. Even if the demonstration worked, even if the detonation was spectacular and unmistakable, would it have changed anything? Japan's leadership in the summer of 1945 was not a unified bloc. This is one of the most important things to understand about the context the committee was operating in, and it's one of the things that made every option they were weighing complicated in ways that a simple moral ledger can't capture. There were figures within the Japanese government who wanted to find a way out of the war. They understood, by mid-1945, that the military situation was irreversible. The industrial base was being systematically destroyed. The Navy was largely gone. The Air Force was running low on pilots and fuel. These men were looking for a diplomatic off-ramp that didn't require unconditional surrender. Because unconditional surrender, in their political context, meant the potential removal or punishment of the emperor, and that was a line they believed they could not cross. But here's what that peace faction actually needed. They didn't just need to want peace, they needed political cover. They needed a shock, large enough, clear enough, and undeniable enough that the argument for continued resistance became politically impossible to maintain. A demonstration on an empty field might have provided awe. What the peace faction needed was something closer to checkmate, an event so total that even the hardliners could not reframe it as a manageable setback. Whether a demonstration could have delivered, that is the question the committee could not answer with confidence. And in the absence of confidence, they moved on. Because, alongside those peace-seeking figures, were hardliners who had staked everything on continued resistance, who believed that a land invasion of Japan could be met with a defense so costly that the Americans would negotiate rather than finish the fight, who saw capitulation as a disgrace worse than annihilation. A demonstration, the committee reasoned, would land in the middle of that internal conflict, and the question was which side it would strengthen. Fact. The optimistic case for a demonstration assumed that seeing the weapon would tip the scales toward the faction that wanted peace, that the visual reality of atomic destruction, even in an uninhabited space, would be so overwhelming that the peace faction would gain the political authority they needed to push through a surrender. But the committee wasn't confident that's how it would play out. The pessimistic case was this: a demonstration on uninhabited ground is not the same as a demonstration on a city. The hardliners would frame it as a bluff. They would say, if the Americans were truly willing to use this weapon on people, they would have done it already. The fact that they chose an empty patch of land means they are constrained, politically, morally, in some way that we can use. And that reframing, if it landed, would make the subsequent decision to drop the bomb on a city even harder, not easier. Because now the United States would have publicly positioned itself as unwilling to do the very thing it was actually prepared to do. The demonstration that was supposed to show strength could be read as evidence of a restraint the Americans didn't actually intend to exercise. There was a third problem, and it's the one that reveals the most about the constraints the committee was actually operating under. They had 2 bombs. 2 completed weapons ready for deployment. Not 200, not 20. 2. A demonstration used one of them. And if Japan chose, after the demonstration, to continue refusing surrender, the United States would have 1 bomb left. 1 shot at the same psychological impact they'd just attempted. 1 chance to prove that the demonstration wasn't a final act of mercy before retreat. 1 weapon isn't a campaign. It isn't sustained strategic pressure. It's a single moment that either works or it doesn't. And if Japan called the bluff after a demonstration, if the hardliners' framing prevailed, if the peace faction couldn't gain traction, if the calculation held that American losses in a land invasion were still preferable to unconditional surrender, then the committee believed they would end up in the worst possible position. They would have used their most powerful available tool for a display instead of a result. And then they would have used the other one on a city anyway. But this time, after the demonstration had failed. After they had, in effect, already warned Japan and received no response. The moral and strategic position of the second drop would be different, not better, possibly worse. And the committee was not willing to construct a scenario where the only path to ending the war ran through a prior, public failure that they had voluntarily staged. This is the architecture of the decision that tends to get lost when people debate it with the advantage of hindsight. The committee wasn't choosing between a demonstration and nothing. They were choosing between a demonstration and a direct strike, and they had to make that choice with one eye on what happened if the demonstration failed and the other eye on an invasion timeline that was already being drafted. They were not choosing whether to use the bomb. That question, for most of the committee, had effectively been answered. They were choosing how to use the time and the weapons they had to maximize the probability of ending the war before the invasion clock ran out. And the demonstration option, when you trace all its branches, kept running into the same wall. It required Japan's leadership to respond in a specific way, a rational way. A way that the committee, watching Japanese military messaging and observing the response to months of conventional destruction, had serious reasons to doubt. None of this means the committee got it right. This is not a vindication of their decision. It is an attempt to understand it on its own terms, in its own context, with the information and pressures they were actually working with, rather than with the clarity that comes from knowing what actually happened. History has the privilege of finality. The committee did not. What they had was a set of options, each with failure modes, each with risks that couldn't be fully quantified, each embedded in a strategic situation that was producing casualties every week. The war continued. They were trying to end a war, and they were trying to end it in a way that didn't sacrifice the only leverage they had on a demonstration that might not work, against a leadership that might not respond the way the optimistic scenario required. Whether that reasoning justifies what followed is a different question. That question belongs to ethics, not strategy. 2. The ethical dimension of the committee's deliberation is where things become genuinely painful to sit with. There were people around that table and adjacent to it in the scientific community who understood clearly that using the bomb on a populated city meant killing civilians at a scale that had no precedent in a single event. They knew what they were discussing. The word city in their planning documents was not an abstraction. Some of them pushed back. Some of them argued, persistently, that a demonstration was worth the risk of failure because the alternative, a strike on a populated urban area, was a moral threshold. They believed the United States should not cross without first exhausting every other option. Their argument wasn't that the demonstration would definitely work. It was that the obligation to try it was more important than the fear of it failing. That the moral cost of not trying, of choosing strategic certainty over moral process, was a cost that couldn't be calculated in the same language the committee was using. That some thresholds, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. And that crossing them without attempting the alternative first was a different kind of failure than the one they were trying to avoid. And that argument lost. Why did it lose? Not because the committee was indifferent to the moral weight of what they were deciding. The record suggests they understood it. But they were operating inside a logic that prioritized strategic certainty over moral process. They were trying to solve a concrete problem, how to end the war as quickly as possible, and the demonstration option kept presenting itself as a mechanism with too many variables, too many potential failure points, too much dependency on an adversary's internal politics, behaving in a specific way. The clean answer was, we cannot afford to be wrong about this. The messier answer, the one underneath, was, we have already decided that using this weapon is acceptable if it ends the war. And once that decision had been made, even implicitly, the demonstration wasn't competing on moral grounds anymore. It was competing on strategic efficiency. And on those terms, it kept losing. The committee also considered, briefly, a middle path, targeting a military-industrial site rather than a city center. Something real, something military, but potentially less catastrophic for civilians than an urban strike. It didn't survive scrutiny either. A military installation meant a more dispersed blast area, and the weapon's psychological power depended precisely on its ability to erase an entire environment in a single moment. A hardened facility wouldn't convey that totality. The gap between demonstration and city strike, once you traced all its forms, turned out to be smaller than anyone on either side had hoped. And that gap, once visible, raised a question neither side wanted to answer directly. By the time the committee reached its final recommendations, the demonstration option had been rejected not once, but in several of its possible forms. A remote detonation, a formal warning with a disclosed location, a military-industrial compromise. Each one examined, each one found wanting for overlapping but distinct reasons. What remained was the strike itself. And what the committee passed upward was not a recommendation made lightly, but one made under a specific set of pressures with a specific set of fears about what failure looked like in each alternative scenario. The fear of a failed demonstration was not a minor note in their deliberations. It was central, because a failed demonstration didn't just mean wasted leverage. It meant a potential hardening of exactly the resistance they were trying to break. It meant signaling weakness at the moment they needed to signal finality. And that, the fear of signaling weakness with the most powerful weapon ever built, tells you something important about the nature of the moment they were in. Power, in that summer of 1945, was not just about what you had. It was about what you were believed to be willing to do with it. The atomic bomb's strategic value was not only in its destructive capacity, it was in the certainty it communicated. The sense that there was no response, no defense, no negotiating position that could protect you from it completely. A demonstration hedged that certainty. But here's the part the committee couldn't say out loud. Offering a warning said, "We have this, and we want you to know it exists, and we are giving you the chance to respond before we use it on a city." That sentence, on its face, sounds like mercy, but the committee read it differently. They read it as, "We have this, and we're not entirely sure we'll use it the way you fear we will, and we are buying time while you decide how to respond." One of those is a warning. The other is an invitation to negotiate. And the committee believed Japan's hardliners would treat any demonstration as the second thing, not the first. The week the bomb fell on Hiroshima, the war ended within days. But that ending came after a second bomb, after Soviet entry into the war, after a set of conditions so layered and simultaneous that historians have argued for decades about which variable was actually decisive. The bombs alone may not have been sufficient, or they may have been the final weight on a scale that had already been tipping. The historical record doesn't give a clean answer, and anyone who tells you it does is simplifying in a direction that suits their argument. What that ambiguity means for the demonstration question is uncomfortable in its own way. If the bomb's role in ending the war was decisive, the committee's fear that anything less than a direct strike would fail to compel surrender was at least partially validated by outcome. If the bombs weren't the decisive factor, if it was the Soviet entry, if it was the internal collapse of Japan's ability to maintain the hardliner position against a peace faction that had been waiting for its moment, then the logic that dismissed the demonstration was built on a premise that may have been wrong. The direct strike may have been unnecessary to achieve the result, and the demonstration may have been enough, or close enough, that it was worth trying. History doesn't let you run the other branch. That's the thing about alternative histories that makes them so hard to close. They don't resolve. They stay open. They sit next to the actual record and ask, what if? And unlike most historical what-ifs, this one doesn't feel abstract. It feels proximate. It feels like a door that was briefly visible and then shut. The people in that room in the summer of 1945 were trying in real time to answer the same question without the ability to run the experiment. They had to choose one branch and live with it. Or rather, other people had to live with what they chose. The demonstration that didn't happen isn't a ghost. It's a question. It's the question the committee asked, debated in multiple forms, and answered in a particular way, under particular pressures, with particular fears about what failure looked like in each direction. Understanding why they answered it the way they did doesn't make the answer right. It makes it human. And that might be the hardest thing about this history. Not that monstrous people made a monstrous decision, but that serious people, with real information and real fears and real stakes, made a decision the world has been trying to reckon with ever since. The reckoning didn't end when the war did. It continues every time someone asks the question the committee was asked, and realizes that the honest answer is more complicated than they wanted it to be. At the beginning, the question was, why didn't they just show Japan what the bomb could do? The answer that seems obvious, because they didn't care, is wrong. The answer that seems cynical, because they wanted to use it, is incomplete. The answer the committee actually gave, in the room where it mattered, was this: we cannot afford for it to fail. Failure doesn't mean we try something else. Failure means we've spent our only warning on a signal that gets reversed into proof of hesitation. Failure means we walk into the remaining options weaker than when we started. They were afraid of the demonstration, specifically afraid, in a way that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with what they believed the stakes of failure were. Whether that fear was justified, whether the logic that drove them to a city instead of an open field was correct, or self-serving, or shaped by pressures they hadn't fully examined, is a question you're allowed to hold. The committee held it briefly, and then they moved on. We don't have to.